Okay. And so no Negroes in Connecticut, Sears and Scene. Paul Taylor is really exploring the nature of visuality. Um, what did you guys think of this? Was there anything in particular that stood out to you or something you hadn't really thought of before?
Overall, I would say it's very interesting reading. I will say there are definitely parts that went over my head, like section four. I was having a hard time working through that one. But in general, the idea of like depersonalization and like the how they identify themselves, and with the fanon reading, fanon reading gave me a lot of feelings of like how it feels to deal with anxiety and stuff all the time. And it's like it's interesting how it's being compared into a like, well, not compared, but like referenced in an entire racial aspect. Like this is the constant. So I think that was one thing that really stood out to me.
Yeah. Um, so we'll get to section 4 for sure and kind of explain some of that. It was very heavy on some history of philosophy and referencing a lot of authors that y'all probably aren't very familiar with yet. Um, but just to kind of go chronologically through it, um, the section on setting the stage and blacking up Zoe. Zoe Saldana is a lighter skinned Black woman, and she was cast to play Nina Simone. And critics found this to be problematic because, first of all, there are plenty of actresses that are appropriately dark skinned that could play Nina Simone. And they felt that the casting of Zoe was, in a way, contributing to the erasure of significant identity aspects of who Nina Simone is. Um, and as I was reading the section, I just kept thinking of like Viola Davis. Viola Davis would have knocked that out of the park. Um, but it brings up this point of Black visibility, which is the major focus of this whole chapter from Taylor. So theorizing the invisible, the section looks at some authors and um, sort of the building of this idea of Black invisibility throughout history. And he talks about two crucial aspects of the problem of racial invisibility. One, the narrator's invisibility results from the construction of the viewer's inner eye, or more precisely, results from the construction of the inner eye out of resources provided by white supremacy and anti Black racism. And then goes on about the second contribution is that it reminds us of the problem of the red-faced man from Far From Heaven in that little introductory script at the beginning of the chapter. That the construction of the inner eye overrules, in a way, the evidence of the senses, which results in people who refuse to see. So that is on display in that opening because they are talking about desegregation and carrying on as though the Black characters don't even exist in the scene. And so that really is a good encapsulation of what Taylor talks about in this chapter, which is that there are ways that Black characters and Black people are rendered invisible. And he goes on to talk about ocular centrism first, before getting into how they're made invisible. And so in that section, let's see, invisibility is what happens when the seer fails to credit the two-ness of the Negro, when we see Black life only through the eyes of others without attending to the counter-hegemonic impulses and practices that might make Black life more than a problem. And double consciousness is what happens when Black people struggle against the socially cultivated habit of refusing to see the specificity of their own experiences and conditions. That's on page 39. at the end of his little section on Du Bois and Second Sight, which leads into sort of a discussion of the whitely gaze. Uh, so not only do Black people become invisible to the other, which is a word that we've encountered already in our readings, especially with Apia. Um, Not only do they have to struggle against becoming invisible to themselves as persons, as Du Bois points out, they also have to struggle against losing sight of themselves, against losing the capacity to envision and construct themselves as embodied points of contact between self and world. So the whitely gaze, what is whitely? How does he describe that term in the reading? Any ideas? Did you guys take notes on the reading? So whitely refers to the ways of interpreting, navigating, and inhabiting the world that are consistent with or that follow from white supremacist ideology. So he's separating the idea of the white gaze from the whitely gaze. Whitely furthers the conditions of white supremacy, whereas just a person being white doesn't necessarily do that, because there are obviously anti-racist white people as well. But specifically, the whitely gaze has this claim to objectivity that is sort of embodied by the history of philosophy, which is what he talks about with theorizing visuality. He talks about Hegel and Marx and Heidegger and all of these philosophers who in these different levels of ocular centrism have kind of taken an approach to philosophy where they take this God's eye view, this objective, separate view of the world that they are not necessarily interacting with or affecting by observing it. And philosophy has come a long way since then. We now understand that there is a reciprocal relationship between observer and observed, and that our participation and the ways in which we view things affect our relationships to them. And so that's what he's talking about with ocular centrism, that between the retina and the world is inserted a screen of signs. And so, Cade, you may be familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis from anthropology, and Edward Sapir studied with the Hopi tribe and sort of, correct me if I'm wrong here because it's been a while, um, sort of settled on this conclusion that because they did not have a piece of language to refer to time, that they did not experience time in the same way that we do, or perhaps experience it at all. Um,
Yeah.
that has since been debunked because the structure of the study that he did was really not sound and was incredibly biased towards his own perceptions, which actually sort of proves the point of his conclusion. So what Taylor is talking about here is really heavily related, that the ways in which we are conditioned to see the world obviously affect how we interact with the world that we perceive. And so there is this screen or cognitive filter that exists between us as observers and the world that we live in. He gives a really simple example of looking at a building in Spain and just sort of seeing an abstract understanding of a building, whereas somebody that lives there and experiences the history of their culture would see either cultural tensions of history in which a mosque was converted into a cathedral, or things more specific to that area. And so he goes into yeah, so he on page 44 he specifically says that the term visuality was introduced into the English lexicon to signify a kind of pictorial vision that gives history both structure and meaning. And do you guys know what epistemology is? Because I noticed he used that term quite a bit. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's how we know things, what qualifies as knowledge, and that is a heavily sort of anthropological, interpretable field of study. So, in on page 45 in the three levels of ocular centrism, he talks about Western epistemological tradition, which is what I kind of mentioned earlier about the knowing subject approached reality as a disembodied spectator, surveying an essentially static reality from the outside. Um, this is a huge contributor to modern liberal individualism and the idea of the self as an isolated entity rather than a being or entity that exists within a network of mutually contributing things. So not just other humans, but our environments, um, animals, education systems, everything. And that's sort of a more of an ecofeminist approach to the self as this embodied and embedded entity rather than this disembodied spectator. Um, I do like the wording that he uses here, that we are a mirror to nature, because that, as the mirror, it makes us disconnected from nature when in fact we are very much a part of it. And so that philosophical tradition has evolved, and that's what he talks about, going from metaphor to materiality in the 1820s and 30s with the development of cinema and post-impressionist painting, and our connection to ocular centrism and the importance of sight and how we perceive the world was altered by um, the modernist phase and the industrialization of the visual, um, or visible, through the mass production and commodification of images, through the development of cinema, through the development of photography. And I, on page 46, found this quote really interesting. By the 20th century, this process becomes so advanced that social critics and theorists begin to worry about the culture industry and the society of the spectacle, in which images come to mediate all social relations, and citizens become passive, isolated, alienated spectators to what should be their own lives. Does that sound familiar to any of your lived experiences about social media? Yeah. There's a really great Japanese horror film called Pulse, and there are these sort of ghosts in the internet, and people keep disappearing, and it's a really, really beautiful film. I highly recommend checking it out if this subject interests you, because Japan has always had this really wonderfully insightful ability to see the future of technology, and Pulse, even 20 years ago, was an allegory for the internet, which claims to connect us all, actually results in isolating and alienating us. Um, that was really before the rise of social media, but with social media, not only are we more isolated, our perspectives of ourselves are impacted by these portrayals of perfection or popularity. And so we end up trying to visually model or mimic what we're seeing instead of having that freedom of self definition, um, which I think is really important to this reading. Um, I might even speculate that Taylor would consider that the postmodernist phase, um, that follows what he's discussed in this section. Um, and he also sort of briefly at the end of 46 and on to 47 is talking about Foucaultian power dynamics, and that these images and the capacity to organize our visual experience is a resource for an exercise of power. And even that exercise of power now is becoming alienated and disembodied through the use of AI and algorithms that determine what we see, why we see it, manipulate our emotions about the world. Um, yeah, so I really think that Taylor would agree with me that we're now in a postmodernist phase beyond what he wrote about even just 8 years ago. Um, would you guys agree with that? So I liked his appraisal of politics on 47. Politics is crucially a matter of mobilizing meaning to frame the way moral agents understand themselves and their prospects. This contest over meaning does not pit all powerful rulers against duped subjects. Rather, rulers and ruled occupy the same terrain, though the rulers, of course, have significant advantages, and struggle against each other, in part by marking out and taking up different semantic positions. Later on, we're going to read um, a piece from Bell Hooks. There's one from the textbook, but we may read this other one by Carol Hanisch too. Uh, but it is titled Feminism is for Everybody. And Bell Hooks sort of coined the phrase, the personal is political. And I think this section from Taylor really embodies that by acknowledging that we are all in a shared field. And like I was saying with social media, that these things are being exacerbated. And so it's really obvious that we are all in the same terrain, but we are taking various positions that affect our advantages and disadvantages, which I think can be seen in like Elon Musk's purchasing of X and the way that he has used that platform since then. Um, and that he is participating on the same platform in the same field as all of the rest of us proletariat, lower level humans, and yet his semantic position is treated differently uh, due to his advantages, but also because his position grants him more advantage. Does that make sense? So overall, Taylor's point here is that visuality is racialized because of the history of our country and because of the history of ocular centrism. And this, especially with his exploration of presence and personhood, talking about how Black people exist in a space, but even their presence is a sort of absence due to how they are depersonalized. And their personhood is manipulated into stereotypes and stock figures, tokenized. Um, all of this kept reminding me of Appiah and how plainly he stated that race as a term simply cannot do all of the things that we ask it to do. Um, and the burden of those expectations are put on Black Americans because race can't do it. And erasing race can't do it either. And so Taylor does a really good job of highlighting the pressure that comes with being a Black American, of having to navigate who am I? How am I seen? What does the culture think of me? And I wonder, as a white person who has spent a lot of time in Black spaces, what it would feel like if everywhere I went, I was treated as an ambassador or representative of all whiteness. Because that's what Taylor is getting at here, is that a Black person participating in the world doesn't only represent themselves, they represent the burden of race in its entirety. Did you guys get that from the reading? Good. Yeah, on page 53, he quotes Gordon very simply. Anonymity in this sense means that to see that Black is to see every Black. Woof. Can you guys imagine what that would feel like? I think it's interesting to teach this course without a Black voice present. I do have lots of Black students in the asynchronous class, and I look forward to hearing their appraisals of this reading, but I do feel that this section was very much written for white folks to be able to see themselves in the burden of historical concepts of race. Um, the syllabus that I built this course from was taught by Dr. Duncan a few years ago, and I actually nixed a couple of the readings that she had in there so that we could include this one because I just feel like it's so important to recognize how these violations against presence, personhood, perspectives, and plurality are so important to not only the Black experience, but as us trying to learn how to be anti racist, to keep these things in mind because they are very, very significant to the Black experience. And if we aren't aware of it, we can't accommodate, we can't change, we can't use it as a resource for progress. Um, so the next section of this reading is on perspectives and plurality, wrapping up this chapter. Plurality, I want you guys to pay particular attention to because it is a concept that is important not only to race, but also to gender and class. Um, so take some good notes on that section and come to class with your own ideas. So before I let y'all go, I want to play a video. Um, pull it up here. It's a song called Strange Fruit. Ooh, my computer's running slow. So it's by Billie Holiday, a Black singer. Um, the one I'm going to play was recorded in 1959. And this song is about the experience of Black Americans during a period of lynching across the country. And so strange fruit are the black bodies that hang from the trees. Um, I feel it's important, especially in the context of this reading and the acknowledgement of the erasure of Black art and Black voices from our history, that it's important to go back and visit these things that are missing from our history books. Let me share my screen.
At Chewy,
Oh,
it's easy to get the food they
sorry, I'm
love to
not
try
logged in anymore, apparently.
with the science-led nutrition you trust. Chewy, for the food they dig into, for fast shipping, for life with pets.
With Venmo, you can
Oh,
support
come
your favorite
on.
artist with a quick payment on the spot. Earn cash back with the Venmo debit card at the places you love, and fuel your next night out.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter
Man, that song gets me every time. Oh no, stop. So that song was banned from radio stations, from Columbia Records refused to even record it. Henry J. Anslinger, who is like arguably one of the worst people in American history. He ordered Billie Holiday to stop performing it. Specific cities banned it from being played within city limits. Boston, Detroit. Um, there was also a book that mentioned it that was banned until Eleanor Roosevelt intervened and protected it. So that's a really good example of, I mean, a very stirring song that communicates a Black experience that white people determined was too big of a threat to them, so we tried to erase it. So I would encourage you to play it for your friends. Make sure it doesn't get erased. I think it's really important. And it brings me to on page 55 in Taylor, he quotes, Africanism is the vehicle by which the American self knows itself as not enslaved but free, not repulsive but desirable, not helpless but licensed and powerful, not historyless but historical, not damned but innocent. And that's a quote from Toni Morrison. And I think she's absolutely on to the truth with that quote. So looking to the future, I think it's important to shift our framing from, there seems to be this attitude among white populations that, well, I never owned slaves. I'm not responsible for that, and therefore can't be held accountable. And if we can shift our understanding and framing of that, not historyless, but historical, she says that because when we took slaves from Africa, they had to give up their language, they had to give up their motherland. They don't know what part of the country their families came from. They lost their entire history as a people while we gained ours. And so instead of viewing it as they are historyless and we are historical, if we can alter that framing to view it as a shared history, that yes, we may have taken their identities from them, but we also established new identities when we did that. And those identities are inherently linked, for better or worse. White people don't want that. Racist white people don't want that. But if we can shift our focus to more of an understanding of a shared history and start to promote Black voices, Black art, Black history within white spaces, then I feel like we can start to solve these issues of ocular centrism. And we're seeing lawsuits happening right now about how race-based blindness is being integrated into AI. There's, I believe, a lawsuit in China where a woman's friend was able to open her phone through facial recognition because AI just thinks that all Asians look the same. So by integrating our history and our diversity of voices that exist in this melting pot of a country, we can start to combat the systemization of these racial issues. So speaking to the future of the class a little bit, week 10, we were supposed to do a research skills and library activity. That escape room style activity was apparently done away with since the pandemic, and we don't have enough time to put a new one together by then. So I'm going to replace that in the syllabus with a couple of other readings to help transition us into the section on gender and sexuality. But I'm trying throughout this course to keep sort of art and pop culture present throughout to sort of prepare us for week 11 when we do our pop culture and philosophy project. Um, so over the course of the next couple weeks, I want you guys to start considering other art, film, music, um, shows, whatever it is that sort of encapsulates and embodies the issues that we're discussing, and start bringing your suggestions to class so that we can kind of start going over those. And like I said, one of my biggest goals for this course is to show us how philosophical ideas shape the world over time and have real world implications. And one of the main ways to observe that is through the impacts of art and how it expands our understanding of our own culture. Um, so with that, if nobody has anything else that they want to contribute today, I will let you guys go. Oh, and finish the Taylor reading and do the Fanon reading in the textbook. I will upload a PDF of the Fanon reading. I know one or two of you are still trying to get the textbook, so I'll get that posted later today.